Hello.
Hi, Chris. I just made you the host, so you should be good now. Can you hear me?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yep.
I'm trying to figure out how to do this.
You shared your screen. I can see that.
Okay. So you can see it? Come,
Yep.
I can't see it.
I think you just need to go to present slideshow.
Like that. Okay.
Yep, that's perfect.
Okay.
I think everybody is here.
We just got a few people.
Yep, let's see, we're missing a couple, but.
Yep. Hello, everybody. How are we doing? I want to get the chat in here too.
Hi, Chris. It's Ruth. Good to see you.
Hi, Ruth. You too. Hi, Courtney. Okay, so maybe we'll just go ahead and get started. This is going to be, or there may be a few people that pop on, but this is really informal. So I've got a few slides, but it's not, I'm open to chat. If you want to have questions, you can either chime in or raise your hand or post something in chat. I'm happy to take any kind of questions or comments as we go through this. It's not meant to be a me speaking at you kind of deal. I just have a few slides for some discussion points on some things that I've encountered and in the last year plus with the pandemic and certain things that are kind of popping up as we go through working with contractors and property owners and things like that of issues that they're encountering. And so I thought we'd pull a few things out that you may have heard me speak about before, but kind of talk about some more particulars about some of the biggest issues that I see, and anybody feel free to weigh in if you've got any comments or anything in regards to this. So the one thing that I wanted to start talking about, because it's something that always comes up, and anybody who practices in this industry, Courtney will know this, and her colleagues will know this too, that the usage of change orders is a really key thing in this industry, and it can lead to a lot of problems if there's a dispute down the road about a project in a lot of different ways. And so I always talk about this when I do seminars, when I talk about the broader subject of contracts. I always bring the issue of change orders up because it seems a lot of times that when we get involved in a project for whatever reason, it's because there wasn't a good paper trail of how we got from point A to point B, and things were missed, or we don't understand why this happened or why that took place, or it took longer. And these are all kind of things you'll hear me, we'll talk about a little bit, but I think it's an area that is a little bit, for some people, not high on their radar screen, and it's, it's almost as important as the subject of having the idea of having a really good contract to begin with, because that can solve a lot of problems. But at the same time, if you have that good contract and you don't follow it and you make changes and during the course of the project, which as we know always happens, it's going to be a problem for you down the road that you need to be aware of. So a couple of things, at least generally on the idea of change orders, as you've heard me speak before, I've talked about this. These change orders, the law requires contractors working with residential customers to have written contracts, proposals, estimates, and it references change orders. So arguably your contract should say you require a change order, but the law also says you need to have a written change order to document that project. And because, as I've said before, a change order is basically a mini contract. It's you're changing some term of that relationship, that agreement that you have with your customer in some respects, and you need to make sure that gets documented so it doesn't fall by the wayside. And the second bullet point there, it's a good business practice. I mean, I've encountered this, lawyers who practice in this area will talk about it all the time, that if we come in after the fact when a project gets sideways because of some issue with the work or the payments, or the timing or the completion, we always want to say, well, let's look at the paper trail. Let's see what's there, what's not there, what's missing. And one of the things that routinely comes up is the lack of or insufficient or not using change orders as much as possible. And I know it can be difficult. It's a pain in the butt to have to go through that process, but I can tell you that from experience, it's certainly a way to have it documented so that you avoid a problem down the road in terms of what exactly took place and why we ended up where we are, why we took so long, why it cost more. Making sure you document it is a good business practice. Can keep you out of trouble and can put to rest some dispute that a customer might raise in terms of those issues. It can be in the form that is easiest for you. There are different ways of doing it. The old-fashioned paper trail way is certainly one option to do it. Have handwritten change orders or pre-printed change orders that you fill out and write in the information. That's still pretty common. A lot of people use those. I've had conversations with clients who use some sort of virtual platform, whatever that may be, some construction management software that allows you to post something in there and for a customer to go in and review it and approve it or sign off on it in some respect. So, you can do it by email. It could be a theoretical change or something that is documenting what the change is going to be, what the scope, change in scope, change in price, change in time, whatever the case may be, but some mechanism that you can go back and say, if push comes to shove or a problem bubbles up in the project, you can come back and say, well, yes, but this is what we told you we were going to do and you approved it, and this is how it changed the project. And so there are different ways to do that. It's just important to make sure you are consistent in doing that, whether you use the old traditional paper form or you use email. I had one time somebody asked me in a seminar, could you do it by text? That's a little bit harder to track because if you did get into a dispute, you want to be able to pull out that text and show it to a court or a judge or somebody and say, well, here's what we told them we were going to do and what the change is going to be, and here's them approving that. And so just being able to track it in some way to show that there was a proposal to change the project in some way, whether they requested or you talk about it, or some other change that's going to be made, and subsequently to that they say, yes, go ahead and proceed, I understand, or whatever the language may be. Just important to be able to get that signed somehow, get some actual affirmative assent or agreement to that, click on the right button that shows a record that they accepted that change that you had proposed or that you talked about, and documented in the system overall. Get it signed somehow. It's not always okay to just send an email with the assumption that a customer is going to respond to it or accept it. Sometimes people say, well, I sent a change order and we just went ahead and did it. Well, in a perfect world, you'd have them approve that or assent to it or some way to make it formal that they're accepting what the proposed change is going to be, so you don't have that dispute on we weren't sure what it meant or this, that, or the other thing. So whether it's a virtual signature or an email response that says, yes, I accept this, or a signed on a paper, just make sure that you have a way of tracking that they actually in some way formally signed that document or agreed to the proposed change. And I think that's one of the keys to keeping the process flowing smoothly, is to make sure you follow up on those and don't try not to get too far down the road without having that change order in place, because if you don't, then it could lead to a problem in terms of what was actually going to be done versus what was done and what was agreed upon, and whether there was an exchange of emails or what it is. And email can be tough to track sometimes, especially if you have customers who are heavy emailers. It can be difficult to track what was going on, what the issues were, what was being requested. So I always think it's good to, if you have a long exchange about a change for whatever the reason, to be able to go back and try to recap it at the end so that you have a clear and consistent understanding of what that agreement is for whatever the change may be, making sure that ensuring that everybody's on the same page. And that can be a real important thing to do. Number of signatures. I actually had somebody bring this up to me the other day about, well, we use an electronic platform, and if we want both people to sign, can we, the platform requires us to send 2 separate emails to the 2 separate people, and we don't always like to do that. We just kind of want to have one. Do we need to have them both signed? They're both own the house, they're both our customers, but we'd really just prefer to have one. And my initial response was, well, I think in a perfect world, if you have 2 customers and they're both entitled to the home and they're both going to be involved in the project, that you should default with the idea that you want them both to sign that. Okay, that you should make an effort to try to get them both to agree to not only the initial contract, but any change order. The worst thing that can happen is you have, one party to the contract is saying they want this when the other party's not there, and the other party just says they don't want that. Now you've got a dispute over who exactly had the authority to approve a change, or what that change was, and what the other party may have wanted. And you just have to be careful with that. And the one way we looked at that in that context was to have language in the contract that says one person can sign, and that signature of the one person is binding on both of the parties to the contract. And I think it's important to have that conversation up front with your customers when you're talking about not only signing the contract, but also change orders, that, hey, we've got this language in here, if you want us both to go through both of you, we'll do that. But we have this language in here that says, if one of you agrees to this and signs off on it, we're going to assume that you both agree, and it'll be binding on both of you. I think having that conversation with your customers and making sure that they're clear on it and understand it, and if they have an objection to it, then you may have to go a different direction in terms of making sure you get change orders signed by both parties, so you can be sure that they're both in agreement on it. Save copies in your project file and in your records of those projects. Well, whatever way that is, whether it's an electronic system, whether it's by email, whether it's a paper copy and you scan it in and PDF it, somehow get all that stuff saved with each and every project, so that somebody after the fact, if there's a problem, can go through and track it from point A to point B and show where changes were made and that things were signed. And there's a reason this is different than what we talked about at the beginning. And here's a document that reflects that. Makes it much easier after the fact to do a forensic deep dive on a dispute when you have all those records in place and can easily show where things might have gotten sidetracked and what disagreements may be able to put to rest because of the existence of something like that, like a change order. And I think I believe there's a Minnesota rule that says you're supposed to keep these kinds of records for 3 years. I would say you should do it for even longer, because depending on the type of project that you're doing, you may have exposure. If it's a major remodeling type project, you could have exposure under the statutory warranty for as long as 10 years. And so having that information, keeping it for that period of time somehow, where they're in the cloud or storage area or storage unit or something like that, keeping that information for a reasonable amount of time can help, again, go back and do a analysis of what took place or what happened in the beginning stages of a project, in the construction phase of a project, if a significant problem with it comes down the pipe later on. It can be really helpful for somebody like me or any other attorney coming in after the fact, being able to look at everything that took place and see how we got to the point that we are in relation to those particular things. So a couple of things to keep in mind there. What should you use change orders for? Everything. Even the things you don't think really need a change order. You would be surprised and again, anybody, Courtney and anybody who practices in this area can certainly attest that little things can become big thorns in somebody's side for reasons you may never understand. And a switch from a minor thing to a different similar product or material can sometimes put somebody on edge to the point it blows up the whole project and the relationship, and it makes things very difficult. So, scope, material, price, timing, delays, anything like that, it's important to just keep in mind that change orders, if it's something different than what you had in your specs, your plans, your material lists, or your discussions at the beginning about timing, if it's something's going to be different about that, you should use the change order for everything that comes up that could affect that relationship. Classic one's always changing in the scope of the project. People in the industry, contractors know it happens all the time. Every project rarely ever ends up being the same as it was intended to be at the start. And so there's going to be change orders on almost every project if you're following your processes properly, because you're going to have changes that happen in the scope of that project. That's the classic one. Switching a door from here, adding this, adding that, making something a little bit bigger, whatever the case may be. All those changes have a resulting effect on the project. And as you see on this other bullet point, a change in scope is often going to be a change in the price, almost invariably. It's either going to go up or down if you're adding or deleting or something, whatever the case may be. So your change order process should switch out, should track both of those items, and making sure that if you're changing the scope, you're providing the credit or you're adding the cost onto that via that change order and reflecting the updated pricing of the project as best as possible, so that you can make sure everybody's on the same page about what's happening. Swapping out materials due to availability. I mean, you've all heard this, and we're all hearing about it in the industry about the unavailability of materials or major delays in getting certain kinds of things. And it's maybe getting better in some areas, and it may be getting worse, but to the extent you're swapping out something due to its availability at the beginning of a project, then if you've discussed one thing and you get in there and you start digging and you start moving ahead and you realize that you're not going to be able to get that material that you talked about with the customer either at all or for some longer period of time, give thought to whether or not you need to go back and do a change order, because changing out certain kinds of materials that were expected by the customer to be there is also the same as changing out the scope of the project. And you want to make sure you document that as best as possible. Tracking both of them, tracking the cost change and a scope change. It's important to make sure you handle both of them, because they all could have an effect on where that project ends up, especially if the cost is not reflected in there and it's not discussed in advance of doing the change order, and you just proceed to do it. Next thing you know, customers angry about it being too expensive and more than what they thought. So documenting those two like and similar changes is another important piece to make sure you have that. Subcontractor change orders. You want to have a process for change orders with your owners, but you also want to make sure you have a change order with your subs. That you have, if you have a sub who's doing a specific type of trade and a very specific type of work, and something's going to change, that's going to change what they've bid you, what they've provided to you as their estimate at the front end of that project. You want to make sure your subcontract agreement has a change order provision, and that you'd use that also with the subcontractor and not just the owner, making sure that whatever the owner, if the owner is going to make some changes and makes changes, and you communicate that with the subcontractor as quickly as possible, and preferably up front, so that you can make sure, look, they want to do this, they want to make this change. I need to know how that changes what you're going to be doing and how that affects your cost of this project and how that affects the overall cost of this project. Because if you're changing something that you're subbing out, you're likely going to have a change in the cost on that front too. So having that process be cohesive between the two of them is an important thing, because if one changes, the other should probably change. That's almost not a question. If your owner's changing something, depending on how you're structured, it's likely that you're going to have a change with the subcontractor as well. one of the problems you have with subcontractors, and one of the provisions that you want to have, is language that talks about, look, subcontractor, you can't do any work without having a written change order signed by me and the owner, project owner, because if you're doing unapproved work and I'm not following my process, something might get done out there that I don't know about, and cost is being passed down to them at some point in time, and it might be unexpected. So situations like having subs on site and they're being asked to do some things that are different than what was initially agreed to, you want to make sure you impress upon your subcontractors the importance of saying, okay, owner, you're going to ask for me to do this change. Let's put the brakes on. Let's huddle up with the job supervisor or the project foreman or the general contractor to make sure that we're on the same page about what this change is going to do to the overall project. Because the last thing you want is having somebody come in and say, oh, well, yeah, I did that work because the owner was home and they asked me to change this, and so I just went ahead and did it. You have to be careful with that, because that's the kind of thing that can come back and bite you if it's not approved and somehow the owner has an issue with what was done. And so making sure that you have that process and communicate with your subs to make sure that everybody's on the same page as far as what's being done, and making sure your subcontractors know nothing gets done, nothing gets changed without me knowing that, because it's important that I know that so that we can make sure we document it and uphold our processes in terms of what we're doing with any changes to the project. Okay, a couple other points. Materials, and I talked about it a little bit earlier, just briefly, but materials, the pricing and availability issues. I've had conversations with both project owners and contractors about issues with availability of certain types of products that people want to use in a particular project. And this has become one of the biggest issues in setting up a project in terms of timing, schedules, costs. And so I wanted to take a minute to talk about that. Know the reality of your project. Know what the customer wants and what you're trying to provide to them, and make sure you do your due diligence on the front end as to the availability of whatever the materials might be, and pricing, because pricing has and will change frequently. But making sure you are diligent up front about specific things that the client may want, and you make sure that you know when you can get them and how long it might take, and whether or not there'll be price changes that could factor into that contract. So just understanding the reality of your project and being realistic about what you're trying to achieve, and upfront, not trying to just get the project in the door and hoping it'll all work out, because that's when it's going to be difficult for you to deal with that project. On that point, build in that lead time for materials into your initial project schedule. Part of that due diligence on the front end is making sure you know how long it might take to get cabinets. You know how long it might take to get this, to get that, and account for that in the project. It may have some hard conversations with a customer about when you think you can realistically get going on a project based upon what you need for lead time on some of the materials that are going to be involved. So you're better off having that occur on the front end by doing your due diligence to evaluate timing and what lead times you need, than just assuming it'll all work out, and then you get into it and you next thing you know, you're telling them, well, I thought it would get cabinets in 6 weeks and it's actually not for 12. And that's going to hold up a lot of things on the project, and you're going to have a really mad homeowner who's going to want to figure out how to get their pound of flesh because of what's happened. And so just understanding those realities is important to deal with that. And a couple other things here I wanted to talk about. Okay, so back to that. Okay, and if you needed to do a change order, if you start down one road and you think you can get it, but it looks like it's going to change, you just do a change order. You say, well, I can't get these cabinets for that. So here's our options. We can either go to a different supplier, we can get a different style cabinet if that can come sooner, or we're going to have to say, we said it was going to be the cabinets and the finish date was going to be X. We're going to have to change that to Y because we're not going to be able to get these materials that we need to keep the project going at the pace that we had hoped we do. I think, as I said before, scheduling and timing are really underappreciated reasons for a change order. It's something that always, I think, is not really addressed in change orders, because there's sometimes an assumption between the parties involved that, well, I know if there could be a change that I make that might take longer. That's just an accepted fact. Well, if it's not documented, that might not be the case. And so I think it's important to understand these timing and scheduling issues are crucial to keeping the communication open with the customer and making sure you don't walk into any potential issue with a dispute over why it took so long to finish a project. And that a lot of times, what we're hearing now is people are upset that it's taking so long, even though contractors have said verbally, maybe without documenting it, that I can't get these materials for a while. So we can't do this part of the work until we have this. So until I have that, I can't call this trade out to do it. And it's kind of leads to a snowball effect that now a project that was supposed to take X number of weeks is going to take X plus 5 number of weeks. And the homeowner is going to be angry that they have to wait to get in, or they can only partially use the property. And so those change orders for scheduling issues can be a really simple thing to do and a good discussion to have with everybody involved to make sure that everybody's on the same page about it. So one of the issues that has come up repeatedly in the last year with the pandemic is drastic increases in price for materials. That's, you get into a project and you're quoted on materials, and next thing you know, 3 months later, the price just skyrockets and makes to the point that now you're chewing up whatever overhead and profit you might have built into that project, because you're having to cover excess costs for materials that you weren't expected and you certainly didn't plan on building into your project. So one of the things that can be used is what's called a price escalation clause. And this is a clause that basically says, look, if prices of materials that to be used in this process increase over X percent, over what we have estimated, that we're going to pass that along to the owners, because that would be for us to float that or take that burden on is not a reasonable expectation for those in the industry. You can protect yourself from those excessive price increases so that you don't end up chewing up all your profit on the project by having to deal with the increased prices, because it's going to be there. And lumber prices, I think, may be coming down, but who knows what it's going to be. And with things kind of being wonky again with the current status of the pandemic, you never know when something else is going to come up and it's going to chew up or lead to a higher price in some other category of materials or some other thing that might be there. Another thing is to look at labor costs, if possible, in terms of price increases. Labor costs can be different as time goes on because of the shortage in the labor market, the labor pool in there, that subs and trade contractors may be seeking higher prices for their workers and for their employees to do work because of that shortage, and they're being forced to pay more. And so they're just like you're going to want to pass on an increased materials cost. They're going to want to pass on an increased labor cost. So make sure have had that conversation too, and if needed, incorporate something that can allows for the passing on of those costs too, so that you're not stuck again now eating up what you might otherwise get in terms of that particular project, eating up some of the profit that you're going to get. So it's an important thing, and I know I've talked to a lot of people about this, and everybody seems to have encountered it, and people want to know what they should do. And we've taken to putting clauses like this in our contracts, or recommending they be added. We typically put it in a change order, in the change order provision of a contract. And you could, if you're going to have a price increase, you do a change order and you say, pursuant to provision 5.3, this material has increased over the threshold level of X percent of what we estimated, and therefore we're passing that additional cost along to you, the owner, because it's not something that we we were going to cover. And that again helps to alleviate those large price changes, which can greatly affect the budget of a project. So this is the provision that we've sometimes used. Obviously, if it's if it due to circumstances not within the contractor's control, think about that. If it's not because you ordered the wrong, if it's because you ordered the wrong product or you made a mistake in ordering and it's going to cost an increased price, that's on you. But if it's purely a change in the market and the materials costs are increasing more than 10% over the amount estimated in the contract price, then we're going to pass that on. The contract price shall be increased by any increases beyond the material price threshold, which is what I said. This is our contract price. If we're going to exceed 10% of that because of increase in material costs, then we are going to pass that along to you, and we will do a change order to document that. And you agree to pay this, whether or not a change order is signed. Again, this is meant to protect you, to make sure that if you can pass this along, even if you don't do a change order. But I know you will, because I'm telling you to do that change order, to make sure that you document that and it's clear on what the change is going to be. Even though this provision says you don't, whether or not a change order is signed, you always should make sure you get that, especially if it's going to be something like this where the price is getting passed along and it's increasing above what you had estimated at the beginning of the project. And contractor, if they don't pay that price increase, you may cease work until the costs are paid, and your cost will be further increased if you have to demobilize and remobilize because you had to stop work for delays caused by the lack of payment for the increased material costs. And this just makes it so that if the costs are going to increase and they're refusing to pay it, if you've got to stop work because you're not getting paid for that, and you haven't agreed with them to change the product or do something different that maybe is a lower cost product, if they want to push ahead with this product but it's still going to cost you over this 10% threshold, then and they refuse to pay it, then you have the right to stop work, and if you have to stop and pull people off the job and come back later and start up again, if you have any increased costs in that regard, then you have the ability to seek that and add it to the contract price as well, because a lot of these things can result in the problem of having a dispute over this, and you're trying to work it out and the project has to stop and they're not agreeing to do it, and next thing you know, everything's on hold and you're trying to get through this the best you can, but you're not able to do that, and so you got to move on and keep your crews busy and keep working on things. And if you have to do that because they're not going to pay, then they should be held responsible for that. Okay, handling project and timing delays. And I talked about this a little bit, but I want to do a little bit more on this. I've had at least 2 to 3 people contact me with concerns about why contractors are starting projects, asking for payment and starting projects for months and months and months down the road. And I know why that is, because they're taking the advice I said earlier, which is factor in lead times for materials. Because the worst thing you can do is start in on a project, realize once you get in there, and maybe you're doing demo or you're doing this, or you're going to realize when you get in there that, oh no, we're going to have a problem with getting this material in a timely fashion. And we may have to stop work for who knows how long while we wait for this, because we can only do so much work around what that thing covers. So the start date is important. And that's why I said earlier, you need to factor in what those lead times are at the beginning so that you can have a realistic idea of what the timing of your project is going to be, so that you aren't overshooting it or undershooting it in terms of how long it might be, knowing what we know about the realities in the industry now, which is certain things can take a long time to get, and that can cause problems with your customer. And that's the thing you want to avoid, because they're going to be the ones that are going to want to hold back payment from you if they're not satisfied with what's happening. Consult with your subs too. I think this is another important one. With the shortage in the labor pool and the availability of labor for lots of different areas, you want to make sure that if you've got trade contractors that are working for you on certain parts of the project, if you're going to have them provide you estimates so that you can build your project estimate, you want to make sure that there's a discussion there about their schedule, their labor availability, what realistically they think they can do, and making sure that they're aware of the project schedule, and you use that to factor in what your start date is going to be and your completion date is going to be, because you want to make sure that you're not being held up because you couldn't get somebody out there to do this. And I've seen this in the last year in various projects I've been involved in, that, well, we could, the framing crew couldn't come out there because they were trying to finish up this other job, or we had to get a substitute painting crew, or we had to do this, we had to do that. Making sure that you factor that piece in up front in terms of your scheduling too, that you'll have the availability and the manpower to do the job that you need to have done, and you hold your subcontractors to that. And even internally, making sure you have your own crews available and you're not giving too many projects, burdening your crews and your people with too many projects that they can't stay on top of the one that they had, the new one you're trying to get. Decide when that first payment should be made. There's been a couple of instances I've run into where somebody is balking at the idea of paying a down payment now for a project that may not be started until the spring. And we know this is the reality oftentimes of what's happening out there, because you need to get so much lead time built in. But on some occasions, there's been contractors unable to explain why they needed such a large down payment up front. And as long as you can say, look, here's the situation, it's going to take some time to get this project started because we have a really significant lead time on certain materials. So we don't want to hold up the project in the midst of it while we wait for materials. So we want a down payment up front. It's going to allow us to order the materials that we need with an expectation that the lead times are going to be significant, but knowing also that we're not really going to be able to start in earnest until much later. But once we do start, we won't be sitting around waiting for cabinets. We won't be sitting around waiting for this or waiting for a crew to come out and do this. We're trying to factor that in, but at the same time to get the materials on order so that we can move ahead with those things as quickly as we can, and making sure that we understand what we've got in terms of the timing. And be reasonable with your completion date. I tell this to people all the time. Everybody wants it to be done yesterday. Customers are going to want the project to be done as quickly as possible, and are going to want it to have been completed quicker than you said it would. And if you can do that, great. But make sure you don't try to give them what they want all the time in terms of completion dates. Making sure you're trying to be reasonable. You need to control that, and you need to communicate what it is and the reasons you're putting your completion date where it is, because you've got these concerns over availability of materials, availability of enough labor to keep things moving. Understand that, have those communications with the customer so that they're aware of what's going on, the reasons behind your completion date. And while it may be longer than we're hoping for, that there's a really good reason why you're doing that, it's because you don't want to give them a false sense of what's going to be done. You're much better off under promising and over delivering, meaning you tell them it's going to be done in 12 weeks and you actually get it done in 10. Nobody's going to balk at that. Everybody's going to be happy with that. But if you tell them it's going to be 10 and you're not done till 14 weeks, that's going to be a problem. And that's going to be a thorn in the side of somebody who's looking to find a reason why they're unhappy with what happened with the project. And it can lead to all sorts of other issues that that arise in the course of that project. So timing, it's just important to understand and make sure you factor that in and keep it in your mind when you're putting these things together. And again, like I said before, do your due diligence. What you need to do to understand how quickly you could get going, and look at the potential hurdles of what might be in this project that could be barriers to completing it when you want to complete it. Those are all important things that you want to make sure that you understand. Okay. Another couple of things. Over communicate when and if you know there's an issue. And a lot of times this comes through subcontractors who may be experiencing issues with stuff they need, or maybe experiencing delays in their crews. The subcontract agreements that we typically use have language in there that says if a sub knows that there's going to be a delay, they need to notify you as soon as reasonably possible. And if they don't, and it causes a delay and increases the cost, you're going to hold them responsible for that. So communicating with the subs, communicating with the owners. If you know there's an issue going to be coming up with timing because of some materials not available, and just get on the horn with them. Sit down and talk to everybody involved, so that if it was something that wasn't expected, obviously if you're having that conversation, it probably wasn't, but being able to get in there and communicate with them so everybody understands what's happened and how you're going to propose to deal with it. Have that communication. Again, document it. Here's the problem we're running into. This supplier has a delay on these materials because they can't get portions to construct what we need to have them construct. This is what we're going to propose to do. Let's have a discussion about it. Let's sit down and talk about it. I'll give you what I think we should do, and we can have a talk about it. Use a change order if needed. Obviously, if it's going to change the timing, if you're going to, because of some delay that you're encountering, you may choose to switch to a different product, or maybe switch to a different subcontractor if that's an issue because one can't get it to you when you want it. Use that change order to document that between the owners and the subs, so that everybody involved in the project is on the same wavelength in terms of what's happening. Because disputes don't arise just with the homeowners. Disputes arise between generals and subcontractors and trade contractors when their relationship isn't clear enough as to what's going to be done and when it's going to be done and how much it's going to cost. So you as the middle person between the start and the finish of this project, you've got your customer on one hand, you've got the trade contractors on the other hand, who are trying to give you what you need to give that beautiful project to the homeowners, and making sure that you have those communications and you understand you got to pay attention to both ends of that relationship. That's important to avoiding a future problem, both with your subs and with your owners. Control what you can control. There's going to be some things that you can encounter. We've had the riots, which cause delays in certain things. There's things that are totally outside of your control that you have nothing to do with, and it's how you sort of talk about those and communicate those and deal with. Most good contracts have language in there that you're not responsible for delays caused by things like weather, strikes, labor delays, governmental actions such as shutting things down in a case of crisis, or things like that you're not responsible for those kind of delays. And some of those provisions also say, look, you have material selection. Lots of times owners are going to be selecting materials, and if they don't do it in a timely fashion, then it might hold up when you can order it and when you can get it and when you can install it. So having those kinds of provisions in your contract too, to make sure that there's language in there that says, look, owner, if you don't timely select your products and materials for this project, it could cause a delay in us completing this work. And if it does, we're not going to be held responsible for any increased costs that stem from that. And we're going to have to enter into a change order that says we're extending this project X number of days or weeks because we've had to deal with the inability for you to make the material selections and order the materials, which is oftentimes going to be the biggest problem. We haven't been able to do that in a fashion that will allow us to keep on the same track that we have. And those can be really uncomfortable conversations to have with people, that needing to have them, to take them to task a little bit about not being prompt or being indecisive about what they're going to do. So I think it's just an important idea to make sure you have that built in there, and you have those communications with your customers and your subs about what is or isn't what is or isn't going to be able to be done, making selections, doing that thing, and having that language in your contract can help make sure that you're not stepping into anything that you're going to be held responsible for, that it's clear that the problem is with whatever the customer is failing to do in connection with that project. Again, change order process should, if you're using it the right way, the change order process will be, is a safety net for you to prevent problems from coming up between you and the owner and you and the subs. And that's why it's really, really vitally important to use the change order process often and effectively, so that you can deal with problems as they come up. And I think in my experience, what I find when I get involved in disputes on a project, when it's either done or there's problems getting it done, or it's invariably some form of misunderstanding or miscommunication between the contractor and the owner. One side was thinking one thing, another side was thinking another thing, or it wasn't explained well enough what was going to happen. And so, and it's impossible from a legal perspective to say, say this, say that, say this, don't say that, because every issue is going to be different. But I think if I could stress it from all contractors, communication is really the key, even if it's a hard conversation to have. Communicating with your customers about problems that arise, issues that have come up, delays that might be incurred, potential cost increases that might be incurred. All of these things are things you maybe don't want to talk about, but ignoring them is certainly not going to make them go away. And it might make a project even more difficult to try to get finished if you have a big barrier to that, because there's a lack of understanding between everybody involved as to what should happen and what is supposed to happen and what actually did happen. So communication is always key. It's just get it out there, talk about it, try to come to some kind of agreement with everybody, and then you document it with that change order, making sure that you're tracking what that discussion was and what the change was going to be in price, scope, or timing, and that gets documented and submitted as part of, put into your project, so everybody's aware of what took place. So the last thing I'll touch on quickly is everybody's favorite subject, COVID and the pandemic and what's been going on with that. And it's obvious the effect it has had on projects might have lessened now, but it's certainly something that's still out there. And there can be concerns about having people in the home, and what steps do my subs and contractors need to take, what steps do homeowners need to take, and how do I deal with that? I suspect, especially here in Minnesota with the uptick in the cases, it's going to continue to be an issue for some time. And you need to be prepared for that. And you need to understand how that fits in, because I'm sure you've been getting questions and will continue to get questions about, well, what do you do about COVID? What's your position on that? Are you vaccinated? Are you not vaccinated? What do you do? Everybody's got a different viewpoint on that, but having these discussions is important, because COVID can affect, and the pandemic can affect a lot of things in terms of availability of workers, availability of materials, which can lead to delays, availability of, frankly, governmental approvals because of an understaffed building department that may not be able to do things as quick as you want to have. And that's, another good point is, if you're doing a significant project which may require a lot of upfront work with the local building official or building department, is to understand what their staffing capabilities are and how quickly projects are getting approved, plans are getting reviewed and approved, because some of them can be taking ridiculous amounts of time to get stuff through, because they're either understaffed or because people are still working remotely in some respects, and it's difficult to deal with that. And so making sure that you also consider that in the context of your project, to ensure that you're covering that base. If it's going to be a long lead time because of governmental approvals for the project, then you want to make sure that, and you're not left holding the bag on that, and that's cleared up and addressed in the beginning. If you substitute crews or materials, if you need it to do a change order, again, if you're going to be changing it because you can't, there's a COVID related problem, or a plant's shut down and you can't get it, or if you got a crew or a trade contractor that's been hit with COVID, you need to be aware of that, how that could affect it, and you need to do a change order. One of the things very early on in the pandemic, and I talked about this when I did the bigger contracts presentation, but one of the big things that came up was homeowners being concerned, or frankly contractors being concerned about, what happens if I bring in What happens if I bring in COVID, or how do we know if I brought in COVID, or what happens if my crews get COVID, or my subcontractor gets COVID as a result of being in there? Well, these are, there was some hand wringing at the beginning. There was some indications that there might be some people in the world that were going to try to pursue claims against contractors for bringing COVID into somebody's home. And sort of the response was sort of two things. Three things actually. One, it would be almost impossible to really try to figure out where it came from, and whether it started inside the owner's home, or it started inside your company or a trade company. There's all sorts of ways that could happen. And the other one was sort of having a COVID plan for your customers. And lots of contractors wanted to do this or tried to do this, and had some sort of thing that they would be able to give to their customers to say, we understand this is a concern. We understand you have concerns about outside people coming into your home during this time, but here are our protocols. Here's what we're going to do, and here's how we're going to handle that issue, so that you can feel more comfortable knowing what our processes are and our protocols are to deal with COVID. And frankly, if you don't like them, then that we may not be able to work together. And I think was an important piece to try to put people at ease a little bit. The other piece was the idea of a waiver, which basically was a waiver that says, look, we understand there's a pandemic. You want to proceed with the project. We want to work with you on this project. We want to have this relationship together. Neither one of us has any idea where this is going to go or what could happen, nor can we track exactly if something were to happen, where it came from. So you're going to agree that if there is any infection that happens, that you're not going to hold us responsible for that due to the difficulty in trying to figure out exactly where it came from. And I think that's a pretty reasonable thing to anticipate. And again, you're just gonna, if that's the road you go down, you just have to have that conversation and communication with the customer to make sure that they understand what is expected, and what if you have that COVID plan in place, what you're going to do about it, and what's expected. And what the waiver means is that, look, we can't, I'm being upfront with you. I don't know if it comes at all, if something happens, we won't be able to tell where it came from. So having to be able to factor that in terms of understanding the difficulty of tracking it down, and not wanting to put somebody on the hook for that when they may or may not be responsible for it, is a pretty reasonable thing to account for in terms of, in terms of the ability to hold somebody liable for bringing the presence of COVID into the home. And I think likewise with subs too, you could have a similar thing with your sub to say, look, I want to know what your protocol is. You don't have to share it with the owner, but I want to know how you're taking care of this and what you guys are doing with this. And maybe having a similar waiver if a subcontractor gets COVID from being involved in one of your projects, so that they don't try to hold you responsible for that when it'd be so difficult to try to track it. So I think that's another important piece that should be considered. Okay, we're coming up on 1 o'clock, I see. I know I started a little bit late, but I don't have anything specific further unless anybody's got any questions. I know we just got a few people, so if you want to unmute and ask a question, or if you want to post something in chat, I'm happy to do it. We've got a few minutes left.
Hey, Chris.
Hi, Dan.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. Sorry I was late.
Okay.
My other meeting ran way over, so never fails. I probably missed a lot. I know I missed a lot about your change order thing. How many contractors out there are not using change orders effectively? I mean, a lot of those end up coming into you. I mean, you find a lot of stuff going on with those?
I do, unfortunately, yeah. And it's usually, frankly, it's a less than professional outfit that just doesn't really have a good contract to start with, and B, a process for making changes, and they just do it verbally, and so it becomes a problem that you have to sort of pick up the pieces with after the fact, and
Yeah.
on both sides of the table. So it's hard. You get a contractor in who's getting sued by a homeowner because of a project going south, and you look at it and you say, well, okay, your contract's got problems, and then you didn't document things, and it can be difficult. So I'm sure there's obviously way more out there than we see
I'm sure.
But,
Yeah.
but there's art, I see a lot of good stuff too. When I work with, especially when reviewing contracts, people will give me their change orders forms or change order processes. And so there's a lot of good out there and there's some bad. And I'm sure there's a lot more of each out there that we never come into contact with.
Yeah, I can imagine. So what do you see as far as, what are some of the key items that people are coming to you for these days? Or is it pretty much, status quo, what it's always been?
It's always, and that's kind of what I talked about, Dan. You missed the first part of it, but
Yeah, sorry.
I always talk about the key disputes that arise are price. Price changes from the start to the finish, and how did we get there? Why did that happen? That's what homeowners always get mad about, is you're telling me it's going to cost more and I don't understand why that is. And then timing, completion. It's, I wanted it done by this time. We're now 6 weeks past that, and it could be for a lot of different reasons. And that's where change orders can really help sort of get you out of that mess if you're documenting it all the way through.
Yeah.
Katie, do you have a question? That's how you came off on mute. Nope.
No?
Okay. Anything else? It's
Anyway.
1 o'clock, so I know that's what we had. If nobody's got any questions, I appreciate the time, and good luck to you all. And I'm sure we'll be soon.
I just make one
Anything
comment. When I was a contractor for 20 years, and I really never ran into very many issues with change orders and contracts because I was so detailed with everything I did, and my whole mindset revolved around the saying I learned once that said, "Trust everyone but cut the cards." And
That's good. That might be a good way to look at it. Yeah.
yeah, and for me, the way that trust, cut the cards was to put it in writing.
Sure.
So,
Well, you're not going to get a dispute from me on that. I live in a world of for the most part, what's in writing. That's really the only way that I can operate, definitively in black and white as much as that's possible.
Yeah, and when I had change orders that were in dispute, if I didn't document them correctly, it's like, dumbass, look in the mirror, who screwed that one up? Yeah, it was typically me. So, but the ones I documented, never any problems with them.
That's good. That's good. That's what it's there for. That's why you do that.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the gold standard there, to avoid those problems by making sure you deal with it during the course of the project.
Exactly. Cool. Well, I wish I could have caught the whole thing. I think they posted a recording of this, so I might be able to go back and listen to it.
Yeah.
So awesome. Well,
okay.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
All right. See you, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Yep. Thanks, Ruth. Bye-bye, guys.
Bye.